Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on AI for employee engagement and predictive people analytics. And today we're just going to take probably about half an hour, 45 minutes, just to run through some of these areas and some of the areas we've been involved with at Weekly 10. In terms of kind of questions, if there's any questions as we go through, feel free to drop them into the chat within GoToWebinar, and we will cover those at the end of the webinar. And again, there'll be some time at the end if you do have any questions that you'd like to run through. So to kick off, just a couple of introductions. So I'm Andrew Roberts, so I'm CEO and founder of Weekly 10. My background prior to founding Weekly 10 a couple of years ago was very much focused around management within the AI and machine learning space, looking at particularly around kind of factory AI and machine learning and improving processes and that side of things. And then I brought a lot of that kind of passion for utilizing machine learning into what we do at Weekly 10, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through today's webinar. We've also got Chris, and I'll just let Chris introduce himself. He's our head of people science at Weekly 10.
Hi guys, so yeah, Chris here, as Andy says, head of people science. What that means is to use a friendly term for psychologist, really. So my background's all in consumer communication and organizational psychology, and I've been working with Andy and the Weekly 10 team for a long while now on making sure that Weekly 10, what we do, works at a behavioral level. So actually we're not just a piece of software which looks at engagement and gives you some nice statistics, but actually we change behavior over time through frequent use of our platforms. So yeah, that's me.
Great, thanks, Chris. So just as a baseline, from our perspective, we've seen Chris obviously on the psychology side, and we have a team, a people science team at Weekly 10. As well as our kind of commercial HR support that we have for our clients, and obviously we invest heavily on the technology side. Just a little bit about Weekly 10 as a whole. We're an employee engagement platform. You'll see some of our clients listed there on the screen. We're based in Wrexham, North Wales, but we have clients globally. North America and Australasia are two very strong regions for us, and it's all based around the notion of a weekly check-in. So checking in really regularly with your manager using any number of our tools through Microsoft Teams, through the web, or through our mobile app. And building a culture of feedback. And then what we do with that is we're able to provide a real step change in the way in which organizations manage performance, but also, and this is more aligned to our discussion today, we also look at how you can measure engagement, and actually some of the smarter ways you can measure engagement, which aren't necessarily the traditional routes. So as I said, we have a platform which covers all of these areas. Today we're going to focus, as I say, a little bit more on the analytics side and how we use AI in that space. So before we start, why employee engagement and you know why bother in many respects? First of all, what is an engaged employee? So what does employee engagement mean in the workplace? Well, at Weekly 10, we distill this down to five areas, really. The first two are about how people feel, how they feel valued and satisfied within an organization. And the next three are about how they behave. So do they demonstrate discretionary effort when required? Do they have pride in the organization? And are they advocates, both internally and externally, for that organization? And these five areas are really important, both from a product development perspective for ourselves, so building the check-in, building performance reviews, building the whole wraparound of what Weekly 10 is, but actually these are really key to our analytics as well. And you'll see that we have actually developed a model which uses these five areas to provide insight into organizations. So that's kind of what engagement is, but then a bit more towards the why. Now, of course, we want people to feel to feel good working for an organization, and we also want people to be happy, and people's well-being is increasingly important within the workplace. However, there is a bottom line to this, and that is the fact that actually if you can move people from being disengaged, and disengaged means coasting essentially, so people doing the minimum that doesn't maybe raise some eyebrows about what they're doing, if you can move them from that level through to being engaged, which means that actually they're demonstrating those 5 areas that I mentioned before, all the research shows that you can see increases in productivity, staff retention, reductions in absence, and also a significant, and actually the most significant area on the screen here is actually an increase in innovation and the ideas and how people actually contribute towards the organization. There is some really good data around that. A report, this is based on a report provided by Gallup, and it's a few years old now actually, but all the evidence points towards some real business benefits from helping increase engagement. So I think Chris will now just take us through the status quo side of things and kind of what we currently have in place.
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about employee engagement traditionally, what most people think about are one of two things. So employee surveys, which I'll talk about first, and then performance reviews, which I'll go on to in a second. Now, neither of these approaches are ideal. So we've got employee surveys here on the screen at the moment. Now we know that from research from Harvard Business Review, that the typical, and this it was calculated in American dollars, but the typical cost of running an employee survey at most businesses is somewhere around £22,000, which, depending on the size of the business, can be pocket change, but for the vast majority of businesses out there, that's a sizable chunk of cash. Now, the negative here is that actually for most companies, they say, well, when we run a survey, we don't see much benefit. Either people aren't actually participating, or the data we're getting often is anonymized, so we don't actually know who's saying what and why they're saying it. There's lots of different issues with employee surveys, so they're not ideal. And then if we look at performance reviews as well, again, similar looking slide here and similar looking statistics in many ways. We know that again, this is from Gartner, that classically most businesses are spending somewhere around about 210 hours per manager in a year on things like performance reviews. And again, the statistics are very similar. 8 out of 10 employees say, well, actually, when I have a performance review, I don't see much benefit for me personally in terms of my growth and in terms of my engagement and in terms of what I actually get done in work. So these systems aren't working for one reason or another, and there are many reasons, and many of these reasons are things that AI can help to target. And now, if you add on top of that what we currently do to this world of the new normal that we're in, and sorry to utilize an already beaten to death term, but yeah, the new normal for work, what does that look like? Well, at the moment, we're all, not all, but a lot of us are working remotely. As you can see, me and Andy today are remote. We at Weekly 10 at the moment are currently remote working, and that's the story for so many businesses across the UK and more globally. So a recent LinkedIn poll, and this is just fantastic response of 73,000 responses here from just some random individuals asking this question out on LinkedIn. But this poll found that actually the vast majority of people out there are wanting remote work to take part, to form part of their work going forwards. So overwhelmingly, so 93% in total want some element of remote work moving forwards, which is really good for a number of reasons, but it's also negative for a couple of others. So let's look at those, I guess. The benefits, first of all, typically speaking, and hopefully we're seeing this more generally across the whole sort of COVID experiment, as it were, with remote working, that people do report improvements in efficiency. There's less stress on the side of employees. You don't have the commute, you don't have, the need to rush back to see the family for whatever reason. Increased performance is something that more and more people are reporting as they move to remote processes. So the guys that run WordPress, whose name escapes me right now. Thank you very much. I was going to say Accenture, and I knew it wasn't Accenture. Automatic, they're 100% remote as a company, and they've reported that moving 100% remote has absolutely massively increased their productivity, generally speaking, and that seems to bear fruit in a lot of other people's experiences. As I said before, better work-life balance and flexible working, and there's probably multiple other benefits here to remote working, but they're some of the key ones. But then on the other side of that, we obviously have the challenges, and this is where sort of the question around AI starts to kick in, because actually we know that we're working much more asynchronously at the moment, so not in line with one another. People are working at different hours because they have kids or other priorities at home that they need to try and work around. the ability to gain feedback in work, and feedback's a key tool and a key indicator of great engagement. The more feedback you give, the more frequently give, almost all the time, you see a correlation with great engagement. But it's actually becoming more difficult because we're not face to face and we're not actually seeing what one another are doing. Now, we're not talking about micromanagement, we're talking about seeing what people are doing, but you do get a general feeling of how the room is and how the team is when you're around them. So it's really important, actually, as we're losing that sort of face-to-face time and that ability to read the room, that we look at smarter and more intelligent ways to actually work with our colleagues and find the data that's driving engagement and driving performance and predicting what's going to be happening in the future. So we'll look at some of the ways in which AI is currently helping now, starting from quite a general viewpoint. So if we look at HR tech generally, there's 5 really key areas, I think, where we can talk about where we see AI within HR tech. So recruitment, we're seeing that a lot when it comes to sort of the screening of and the interviewing of potential candidates. HCM, we're talking about sort of workplace management and sort of planning sort of where and when people are working and what they're working on. The learning and development side, we're sort of seeing a lot of training packages utilizing AI in order to offer up more meaningful training at the right times to their staff. Employee benefits, things like automation and personalization within the employee benefits sort of industry and area of HR. And then engagement, which is kind of where we sit, as well as maybe some of the HCM stuff, because we do a lot around performance. But employee engagement, so things such as sort of real-time feedback platforms, sentiment analysis, which Andy will talk about in a second, all sort of designed to look at the engagement puzzle or challenge and draw real insightful outcomes and data from whatever we can in terms of from the data we have, and utilizing AI to better power sort of the outcomes that we get from that.
Perfect.
Then, I
Thanks,
guess
Chris.
I'll hand over to you at this stage, Andy. You can talk through check-ins.
Fantastic. So obviously focusing in on engagement and some of the examples of how we use AI and machine learning within the platform, and it's a big area for us. I think if we just think back to what we talked about, the status quo, and Chris talking about surveys particularly, I think in this respect, surveys are a pretty basic way of understanding the engagement of an organization. So you have this obviously this concept of providing questions. In fact, there are a number of kind of providers out there. If you want your engagement data, you might run a survey once a year or every couple of years, and you'll typically need your employees to answer 70 questions. So 70 questions of your employees to provide that data. Now, there's a couple of things that come from that. The first thing is that you can't expect your employees to do this all the time. They're not going to engage with 70 questions. So you're not going to understand a real-time pulse of your organization. You're not really going to understand how your organization feels over time. So typically, most of the people that will be doing this will maybe have run one survey during lockdown or during the challenges we've had recently with COVID, and some maybe not have run it because they weren't too keen on seeing the results. But either way, you're doing this just as a snapshot in time. And whilst that might be okay as a benchmark, it's not really helping you to be an agile organization and to be able to understand your the organization more widely. So there are some significant limitations there. The second major issue that we talked about in terms of employee surveys is that they're pretty much from an employee's perspective, they're giving a lot away, but then tending not to receive much back. So the value exchange there is limited, because the turnaround time from those surveys can be quite a long period of time. Now, this is one of the reasons why Weekly 10 is very much focused on rapid, short-term feedback. And for us, that doesn't mean asking lots of questions which you can get data out of all the time. So your quantitative analytics. So how are you feeling between 1 and 5 every week? But actually, this is more about how are you actually interacting over that period of time, and how we can understand how you're feeling over that period of time. So the way in which we take the approach to looking at engagement is a little bit different than your standard kind of surveys. So we're going to go into that in a bit more detail now with the first example. in a second with sentiment analysis. Before I do that, I just want to talk about baselining the training of an AI. So if we think about artificial intelligence, and we think about machine learning and artificial intelligence itself, you typically need to train an AI to be able to perform its job. And there are three predominant streams around this which allow you to train an AI such that moving forward that it can give you some useful information. Just as we train the human brain by learning, so when we're a baby, of course, we have some innate natural tendencies, but we learn, whether we learn speech or what have you, all of that is based on what we learn over time. Now, there are three ways in which you can train an AI. The first is supervised, and supervised is what we typically call task-driven. So this is really, here's a load of data, and based on the data I've given you, what does the next value look like, or what does what does it look like from that perspective? And we'll talk about supervised machine learning in more detail, because that's one of the main areas where we'll see we take advantage of at Weekly 10. The second is unsupervised. So this is actually where, instead of saying categorizing things and providing that data to the AI, you're essentially just providing data. And when you do that, the AI is then building a neural network, which is essentially tends to be clustering. So what it's doing is it's looking at patterns within that data and then making its own mind up against it. So it's essentially a slightly longer-winded version of the supervised. So supervised is giving more information to the AI. Unsupervised is relying on the AI actually doing quite a lot of processing and grouping and clustering. And then finally is reinforcement. So this is actually where you might push stuff through the AI, and when the AI gives you results, you then actually reinforce the learning by taking that data from the output back into the input. So the first thing we'll talk about is a supervised machine learning for sentiment analysis. Now, as I said, with supervised machine learning, what happens is you provide essentially categorized data. So a great example of this is the supervised machine learning that we do at Weekly 10 for sentiment analysis. And essentially the AI has been trained on data, categorized data. So our AI has been trained on millions of text or paragraphs, shall we say, which have been categorized into whether they are positive, negative, or their actual approach, and typically on a scale of 1 to 5. So at a very raw level, what we're doing is we're providing something such as, had a great day working with Chris on the AI webinar, and whether I'm telling the truth or not, that is a positive statement. And what we do is we will push that into the machine learning algorithm, and it essentially learns that sounds like a positive statement. So over time, it is able to build up this picture of what positive, negative, mixed, and neutral looks like within sentiment, and it's doing that based on essentially that pattern matching and building that neural network. And it's very similar to the way a human would do it, in the fact that as a human, you will know that certain things sound more positive than others. The key thing here, and the big advancement in the fact that you can use machine learning here, is that you can actually identify things based on what humans would essentially identify on, rather than just looking for keywords. Because if you're looking for keywords, then typically those keywords don't always appear in the text. And secondly, you can negate keywords, and there's many examples out there where certain terms mean both good and bad in terms of their sentiment, or positive and negative in terms of their sentiment. So you happily do away with the kind of word clouds that you used to get in the past, which is showing you the overall sentiment of something, and now you're actually getting something meaningful. So what actually happens is, once you've built up that model and that model grows over time, so we get more data and we're able to build that forward, we can then provide the AI, the trained AI with a text value. So I feel great about the project this week, and it will return a value. And it doesn't necessarily say this is definitely positive. It will come back with ratios between positive and negative, and whether it's maybe a mixed statement, etc. And based on that data, we can then build the model which shows how positive and negative parts of the organization are in terms of how we do that. Now, this is something which is pretty commoditized these days, sentiment analysis, and you can try this out very easily. You can go on to, if you've got an AWS account, you can go in, put in some text into Comprehend, and it's going to give you whether it's positive or negative, which is great. And this type of technology is used everywhere for from social media analysis within marketing organizations, right the way through, of course, to what we do here at Weekly 10 with performance and engagement analytics. So that's how we build our machine learning model. And in terms of how that looks like in Weekly 10, you'll see here's a really nice example of this, where actually we group certain question types together, and you'll see here we're actually provided with a sentiment and a bit of raw data really to show you, but shows you almost a heat map of positivity and negativity across different functions within an organization. So on the left hand side you can see the question types, and then across the top you can actually see the different areas of the business. And this is all from that from what we do within that sentiment analysis. So as I say, when it comes to the practical implementation of machine learning and sentiment analysis at Weekly 10, every update that we get, every check-in that we get from an employee or how they input into their performance review is then assessed from a sentiment perspective. Now, unfortunately, in terms of that analytics, there are limitations as to how low you can go. So GDPR has a very strong clause in there about profiling. So typically, if you are using AI to estimate sentiment, then unless the employees explicitly grant approval for using that data at employee level, you can't look at it at employee level. So typically we aggregate this up by teams or department level, however that structure might work within the organization, but typically it's at an aggregate level. The second way in which we use that sentiment analysis, and we use that supervised machine learning, is actually using a model we have called 10Pulse. Now, you remember from the beginning of the webinar, that we talked about the 5 key areas of employee engagement: discretionary effort, pride, advocacy, job satisfaction, and the feeling of being valued. So what we've actually done is we've taken that sentiment model, which uses supervised machine learning, and we've combined that with organizational psychology models, which Chris will talk a little bit more about in a moment. But essentially what we've done is we've taken the sentiment data, we've taken the way in which people interact within an organization, the way in which they recognize other people, etc. And again, without the use of a typical engagement survey, we're able to derive a value, an absolute value, as to engagement within an organization. So the challenge with sentiment analysis is it's not absolute. And what I mean by that is the fact that sentiment analysis is relative. So everybody will have a baseline sentiment. So typically you might see marketing and sales within most organizations, we find they have a higher baseline sentiment, okay? But then if you actually look at other functions, typically finance and software development, in fact, you will see that they tend to have lower baseline sentiments. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have lower engagement levels because of that sentiment. But what changes in sentiment show you is actually a trend and a change in a certain direction. And this is one of the reasons why we introduced the 10Pulse engagement score, because what 10Pulse does is it gives you an absolute measure, which uses some of those relative measures and then combines that with some of the other things that we take from the way in which people are interacting. And in that, we're able to, instead of, as it says here, calculate from keystrokes and web usage and and actually tracking people, we're actually understanding those conversations and providing out a pulse of the organization. Because organizations are typically, or they should be, output and value driven rather than kind of the effort side of things. So it is really about how you can marry that across to an absolute measure. So this tool's been really helpful to our clients because they've been able to both look at the sentiment, which is relative, but now they're able to look at an absolute measure and kind of benchmark themselves over time and see that at team, department, or again, organization level. Once again, this is a profiling tool, so we can't provide that down into an employee level, but you can certainly do that across the organization itself. So leading on from that, I just want to talk a little bit about actually one of the major projects we've had on this year, which takes some of what we've learned from supervised machine learning and sentiment analysis and also temples, but takes it to the next level. So we've been kind of, up till this year, we've been touching, just skimming the surface of machine learning. And now with a recent project, we've really taken it to the next stage. So we started a project in January of this year, which was backed by Smart Cymru and Enterprise Wales, which is funded by the European Regional Development Fund. And we've kicked off a project in partnership with Bangor University on looking at predictive analytics around a lot of the metrics we look at in engagement. And actually not necessarily predicting engagement levels, but predicting the outcomes. Because for us, a lot of the data we previously looked at has been backward looking. So we've looked back and we've said, well, you can see your sentiment over time and you can see your trend, and you could probably imply that trends are going in a certain direction. Likewise with temples, again, historically, it's telling you what your engagement level is and maybe what your engagement level was last week, etc. But it's not telling you what future impacts that's going to have. So this project Perceive, is all about the outcomes and predicting outcomes within an organization. So actually, based on the engagement levels that we've had recently, what do we think is going to happen in the future? So what do we think, are we going to have higher levels of attrition or staff turnover? Or are we going to see impacts on well-being? And this project is all about that. And it's a combination of psychology, which Chris will talk about in a second, and then combining that with machine learning and targeting actually how we can use machine learning to do that. So Chris is going to give us a little bit about the psychology side of things before I jump into the machine learning.
Sure, thanks, Andy. So we've been working with the School of Psychology at Bangor University on this project. Now, why psychology, I suppose, is a question worth answering. Now, with a certain level of training, anybody can build an AI. But to build an AI which accurately measures and predicts the right sort of behaviors or attitudes or perceptions that we want to actually predict requires a fairly decent understanding of what makes people tick at work, I guess. So combining sort of our machine learning with the behavioral science and organizational psychology stuff, it just allows us to better predict and make sure that actually we're not just giving people numbers and we're steering in the wrong direction. We're actually going to genuinely impact people's work lives. So working with the School of Psychology at Bangor, we've looked at a few key areas. So one being the theory of motivation, or a certain theory of motivation, I should say. So why do we do what we do, specifically within a workplace setting? And this really is built up around three key areas, as are on the screen here. So autonomy, how in control of my work am I, and what impact can I have over the outcomes of my own work? Connectedness, which is really, despite its name, it's really all about sort of mastery and how good we are at our work. So do I have the ability to actually achieve at the level I'm meant to be achieving at, and other opportunities here for training and other bits and pieces that will push me along as in terms of that mastery of that work. And then relatedness, so how connected am I to not just the work I'm doing, but the goals of the organization in which I work, and do they represent me as an individual, and can I help, again, from an autonomy point of view, can I help shape that? Then we also look at sort of behavior, attitude, and perception change. Now, that's essentially what we're in the business of changing. We want to improve people's workplace behaviors. Now, to do that, you usually have to tackle attitudinal problems or problems in and around perception. So we need to understand what those three key different drivers are of what we are and what we do at work, and how can we better nudge people away. Now, and what I mean by a nudge is small changes within an environment. So typically speaking, the outcomes from weekly 10, we don't then go on to large scale interventions. We talk about small changes that can be made. But from an AI point of view, we're looking at what drives these changes in terms of the data we've got that we can then pull that into the AI elements. And then social proof. So humans are social animals, like most, and we do sort of look at what people in and around us are doing, and quite often we'll copy them. That's why you quite often, if one department has an issue with attrition, you don't tend to just see one person leave. Quite often that could be a domino effect, and you can see a number of people leaving a business. So understanding, the role in which our social circles at work play and feeding that into our AI is really key as well. So that all goes into the project. The book on the right here is just as a side point. If anyone's interested in sort of behavioral science, and specifically behavioral science within the workplace, this is a really nice sort of pop science book to get you started on discovering sort of how psychology plays a role, and a bit of a better understanding of how we're utilizing it here at Weekly 10. I can highly recommend that book to read.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Cool. So taking what Chris has just said around psychology has really pushed into what we're doing with Perceive. So Perceive is a combination of psychology and machine learning. And the reason it's a combination is because all those things that Chris just mentioned are fed into the team that are doing the machine learning. So our software engineers who are experimenting, and it allows us to really focus in on the data sets we have. So we can run machine learning and we can do unsupervised machine learning across all the data we have within Weekly 10, the 10 pulse data, the sentiment analysis, the way in which people are using the system. But the thing is, there's so many different red herrings that come out of that, and it's a very inefficient use of machine learning in many respects. So typically what we do is we look at the psychology behind what Chris has just talked about, so whether it's theories of motivation or anything else, and then feed that into the way in which we experiment in the project. And then when we experiment in the project, it's quite targeted. And yes, we still use unsupervised machine learning to do clustering and bring certain things together. But then when we see those clusters, we then feed that back through to Chris and his team to actually understand whether this makes sense from a psychology perspective. And at that point, we can really jump in further. Now, for Perceive, we use something called long short-term memory in terms of the platform itself. And what this does is it provides essentially raw data and events into the platform. So what we do is we take the data we have within Weekly 10 and then also some outcome events. Okay, so these might be things such as people leaving an organization. Okay, and in this instance, I'm going to talk about attrition. So one of the big outcomes and I'll talk about outcomes of the project in a second, but one of the main focus areas of the project became predicting when people will leave an organization. So what we're doing is we're taking our engagement data, essentially, and from that data, trying to understand patterns in whether people are going to leave or they're at risk of leaving the organization. And LSTM is really good at this, because what we can do is we can provide that raw data, and then we can provide in customer data which looks at when people have left organizations, and we can essentially look at what leads up to that event occurring. Now, the reason why LSTM is really good is that it looks at the order of events, and that's really important because it's quite easy to run clustering on a bunch of data. But actually, when you need to start looking at time series and actually the run up to things, then that's the important thing. Because what it's important for us to understand is not that these 5 events happen that make people leave. It's actually potentially the order in which they happen. Okay, so if we look at the system and we say, okay, somebody's submitted a check-in and they've had this level of sentiment, okay, when they submitted it, then the manager has responded to that, and the manager has responded in a negative way. Okay, now because they're tied together, we have a nice idea actually, how is the manager supporting that person, etc., etc. But actually, if we don't have the order of those events, then it can mean something entirely different. So LSTM is really good at basically provide utilizing the time series and the order of events combined with clustering of data and how that works. So raw data and events that are fed into the system, and then off the back of that we obviously get a prediction, and then we, based on that prediction, we look at we're actually able to retrain the model and back and feed in this kind of feedback loop. So when we get data out and it says, right, okay, well, we predict X, Y, and Z is going to happen, we actually then see whether that's going to happen. And if it does happen, then obviously that's a positive feedback loop in terms of what we're doing. So we use LSTM quite significantly within this. We will be doing more of an in-depth kind of look into the way in which we do machine learning with our technical team as well, to go into that in more detail. So you'll hear more about that in the future. So the outcome from that project, and this is quite a bland slide, I must admit, but it's the best that our software engineers can do for us in terms of providing it. But what we've actually done is, using that model, we've now been able to train an AI. We have essentially a trained model which helps predict attrition within organizations. And what it does is, up to 6 months before, so a 6-month window before we expect an event to happen, Weekly 10 is able to, and through this project, is able to predict the risk of somebody leaving. And the accuracy of that is around about 70%. So about between 65 and 70% in terms of its accuracy. And this is just this chart just shows you a bit of a high level view as to actually how pronounced some of these indicators are. Now, this isn't, these two blue lines that you see here are essentially where the model, so where we've put some data in for an employee, for example, and what it's done is it's broken the threshold, which is the green line. It's broken that line, and when it breaks that line, that is a strong indicator that this person is at risk of leaving the organization. So what you can actually see here, and these are along the bottom, these are days, so this is 0 to 80 days, and what you can see here is we've actually gone from a trigger point, a threshold of about 0.8, 0.08, sorry, 1.8, what am I on about, through to right the way up here at 0.8. So what you're seeing is a big, in this case, these are really good indicators that people are going to leave the organization. And you can obviously see the expected line there as well. So using that model, we'll be able to build that up. And as you can imagine, as we move forward and we get more data, we're able to reinforce that learning around the predictive analytics in terms of that attrition prediction. So that's been a really big success from that project. And this is very much the area that we're developing further at the moment. Is, yeah, we've got a good handle on what we can do looking at data in the past, but actually, how can that influence things moving forward? And we see that as a very much a combination between psychology and the machine learning aspects. Next on the hit list is the well-being side of things as well. So whilst we've been able to make really good progress with predicting attrition, one of the big areas we want to look at is actually what does this mean from a well-being perspective moving forward? Are people, people or parts of the organization at risk of poor well-being or mental health risk, etc., so that things can be put in place. And this again isn't about, coming back to what Chris was saying earlier, this isn't about deep dark big brother people analytics and the fact that if we predict that somebody's feeling a bit down, they're gonna get proverbial knock on the door to say, do you need any support or what have you. This is actually more about the higher level, and the fact that if you see trends within your organization that things are getting worse in a certain area or declining in a certain area, then you can take positive action. And that might be specific teams, etc. Because typically that's what happens, is typically you're going to see groups of people, at risk of leaving the organization or at risk of poor well-being, rather than those individual people throughout the organization. And that's really, really important for organizations to keep a handle on. So there'll actually be quite a bit more information about this coming out later this year. We'll be publishing a white paper around the predictive analytics and what we've found and how that works. And then subsequent to that, we'll be putting this into the Weekly 10 platform for people to be able to utilize. Some of our clients already have access to this functionality as part of the research and part of the trial process, but we're really excited that some of the results we're getting are really significant in terms of helping to predict those analytics. And as we say, this isn't about keystrokes and that side of things. This is actually about what people are saying and feeling within an organization over time. So with that, I'd like to see if there's any questions for myself or Chris. So if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat channel. There's also a questions screen as well. Feel free to use either. We can have a look at both of those and see which ones you pop a question into. So we'll just give people a couple of minutes to see if there's any questions that you have.
It's probably worth mentioning just why people are maybe going over questions. If you are interested in Weekly 10 and having a look at us, we do offer a free trial, a free demo, and actually, if you're a team of 5 or fewer, I think it is, Andy, a free license for small teams. So it's well worth checking us out at weekly10.com if employee engagement, performance management, and how AI basically helps drive those are of interest to you. Then check us out.
Yeah, fantastic. See somebody typing. So we'll just wait for this one to come through. Okay, so there's a question here about, a little bit related to kind of Big Brother stuff. So do you use any other data other than sentiment to predict outcomes? So it's a good question. So our approach is very much around culture change and feedback. So one thing we didn't go into too much detail on today is obviously the Weekly 10 check-in, which is actually really about not just measuring engagement via the statistics that we talked about, but also about creating a culture. So first and foremost, Weekly 10 is actually about that feedback cycle and making sure that managers and employees are having that conversation, that there is support and kind of wraparound as part of that, and building a culture where things are open and transparent. Kind of the secondary benefit to that is the fact that you can get some really insightful analytics around this. So the insightful analytics is, as we say, it was based around sentiment, but the 10 Pulse does use some of the other statistics, but the statistics that it uses and the data that it uses is really based on that check-in mechanism and the model of engagement that we see within there. So how managers are supporting employees, how people are recognizing other people. So, are certain areas of the business net recognizers or net receivers of recognition, etc., and how all that kind of ties together. Now, in terms of some other platforms out there, they do look at slightly more intrusive data, and there was quite a big controversy recently about a large investment bank, I won't mention the name, who are headquartered in London, and they were doing key logging and tracking how often people were using how often people were using their laptops, etc. And even ourselves, we've been approached by companies to partner on with some of their platforms, and what their platforms do is they switch on the web camera occasionally to see whether somebody's working. And from our perspective, that's not the approach to take in terms of making sure performance and engagement are at the right levels. So we would never go down the route of using that additional data, that kind of active data, or what we might call presenteeism data, to actually understand engagement and that side of things. So we very much feel as though this has to be at a different level in terms of the way in which we use that data. So yes, we do use other data other than sentiment, but we draw a line in terms of where I think people analytics is acceptable and not acceptable from that perspective. I think the other clear thing to remember here, and this is a real positive from GDPR, is the fact that there is quite a lot of protection around personal data, and profiling is one of those things. So you can't be profiled individually unless it's anonymously, within a system like this. So that does mean that sentiment and some of the engagement data is trends over time for certain parts of the organization rather than specific individuals, because I think, again, there is a risk there, and there is there's a question there in terms of efficacy, whether you should be doing that right down to the employee level, and then obviously having those conversations off the back of that. So that's where we draw the line. Okay, just seeing if there's any further questions there. No, I think people are quiet today. So fantastic. So thanks for listening in and watching in today. As Chris said, if you want to find out more about Weekly 10, just pop over to weekly10.com, or drop us an email. Likewise, if you're interested in learning a bit more about AI, machine learning, give us a follow on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook. We're often sending stuff out and around the project we're working on, and we will obviously be publishing more details in the white paper once they're out, and we'll do a follow-up webinar on that to give people in the technical community, and especially related to Technology Connected, more information on that. So thanks for joining us today, and have a great weekend.
Thanks everyone. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.